Imagine you are a German general. It is the early morning of June 6, 1944. The phone on your desk is ringing. Your hands are trembling. Your scouts are reporting something unbelievable. Thousands of Allied ships have appeared off the coast of Normandy. Paratroopers are already behind your lines. Soldiers are flooding the beaches. Explosions are lighting up the horizon like a second sunrise. This is it. The invasion everyone has been waiting for. The moment that will decide the entire war. You know exactly what needs to happen. You need to move the armored divisions, the Panzer tanks, immediately, right now, not in an hour, not after a meeting, now. Every minute of delay means more Allied soldiers on French soil. Every minute means the beachhead grows stronger, harder to break, deeper, more fortified. You reach for the phone, and then someone stops you. You cannot call for the Panzers, they tell you. Only the Führer can authorize their movement. You look out the window. The sun is beginning to rise over occupied France. Somewhere on those beaches, men are dying by the thousands, and the most powerful armored force in Western Europe is sitting completely still, engines off, waiting for one man's permission to move. And that man is asleep. To understand what happened on D-Day and why Germany's response was so catastrophically slow, we have to go back several months before the first Allied soldier ever set foot on that beach. By 1944, everyone on both sides of the war knew that an Allied invasion of Western Europe was coming. It was not a question of if, it was a question of when and where. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command had been preparing for this moment for years.
If you appreciate true Cold War history told in detail, subscribe now. We break down the moments that reshaped the world, one story at a time.
They had fortified the coastline of Western Europe with an elaborate system of bunkers, gun emplacements, barbed wire, and beach obstacles. They called it the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile fortress stretching from the northern tip of Norway all the way down to the southern border of France. On paper, it looked impenetrable, but a wall is only as strong as the army defending it. And the German army defending Western Europe in 1944 was not a unified, well-organized force operating under a clear and decisive leadership structure. It was, in many ways, a house of cards. At the top of the German command in the West sat Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the most experienced and respected military minds in the entire German army. He was the commander-in-chief of German forces in Western Europe, technically the man in charge. But here is where things become complicated. Reporting to Rundstedt, but also frequently going around him, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, who had been placed in command of the forces most directly responsible for repelling any coastal invasion. Rommel's plan was simple and logical. Position the Panzer tank divisions as close to the coast as possible, so that the moment the invasion began, they could counterattack immediately, within hours. Overwhelming force delivered at the exact moment when the Allied soldiers were most vulnerable, wet, disorganized, and still trying to claw their way off the beach. It was a sound military plan. There was just one problem. Not everyone agreed with it. Rundstedt had a different philosophy. He believed the Panzer divisions should be held back, kept further inland as a strategic reserve. His thinking was that the Germans could not be sure exactly where the Allies would strike. If all the tanks were positioned near one stretch of coastline and the Allies landed somewhere else, the reserve would be too far away and too committed to respond. Better, he argued, to keep the armored forces flexible. Let the invasion begin, identify where the main thrust was coming, and then strike with concentrated, overwhelming power. Two experienced commanders, two completely different strategies. And neither one had the authority to override the other, because above both of them, above everyone, was Adolf Hitler. Hitler himself had become deeply involved in the tactical decisions of the German military. He did not trust his generals. He believed with an almost mystical certainty that his own military instincts were superior to those of the professional officers who had spent their entire lives studying warfare. And so, Hitler made a decision that would prove fatal. He kept personal control of the Panzer Reserve divisions, not Rundstedt, not Rommel, Hitler. The armored divisions could not be moved, not a single tank, without Hitler's explicit, personal authorization. Now return to that German general standing by his phone in the early hours of June 6, 1944. Allied paratroopers have already landed behind German lines under the cover of darkness, thousands of them dropping from the sky across the Normandy countryside. At the same time, the largest naval armada ever assembled in human history has materialized off the French coast, nearly 7,000 ships stretching as far as the eye can see. At 6:30 in the morning, Allied soldiers begin pouring on to 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. German commanders on the ground understand immediately what is happening. This is not a feint, not a distraction. This is the real thing. They begin frantically requesting authorization to move the Panzer reserves toward Normandy. The requests go up the chain of command. They reach the top, and at the top, Hitler is asleep. His staff, knowing his volatile temper, knowing the rage that could erupt if he was awakened unnecessarily, decide to let him sleep. They tell themselves that perhaps this is not the main invasion. Perhaps Normandy is a diversion. The Führer needs his rest. They will wait. And so they wait. Hitler does not wake until nearly noon. By the time he is informed of the full scale of the invasion, by the time he processes what is happening, by the time the authorization to move the Panzer divisions is finally given, it is already afternoon. The Allies have been on the beach for hours. The beachhead is growing, and the window that Rommel had warned about, that narrow, critical, irreplaceable window of the first few hours, has closed forever. 6 hours. That is roughly how long the German High Command hesitated, argued, and waited while the Allied invasion cemented itself into the soil of France. 6 hours, during which the Panzer divisions sat idle. 6 hours during which Allied soldiers transformed a desperate amphibious assault into a foothold on the European continent. But the story does not end here. Even after Hitler woke up, even after the order was finally given to move the Panzer reserves toward Normandy, another disaster was waiting on the road ahead. Because the Allies had thought of that too.
War is not just fought with guns, tanks, and soldiers. Some of the most decisive battles in history have been won not on a battlefield, but inside the minds of the enemy, through lies, illusions, and carefully constructed deceptions so elaborate that the truth becomes impossible to believe even when it is standing right in front of you. In the spring of 1944, the Allied forces launched one of the most sophisticated and successful deception campaigns in the history of warfare. It did not involve a single bullet. It did not cost a single life. But it may have done more to guarantee the success of D-Day than almost any other factor. It was called Operation Fortitude. And it fooled Nazi Germany so completely that even after Allied soldiers were storming the beaches of Normandy, even with the invasion already underway, German commanders still were not sure it was real. To understand why Operation Fortitude was necessary, you need to understand the impossible challenge the Allied planners were facing. An amphibious invasion, landing soldiers from the sea onto a defended coastline, is considered one of the most difficult and dangerous military operations in existence. The attacking force is at its most vulnerable in those first hours. Soldiers are packed into small boats. They cannot maneuver. They cannot retreat. They have to move forward into enemy fire with no cover, no support, and often no clear picture of what is waiting for them. The defenders, on the other hand, hold every advantage. They have fortifications, high ground, pre-sighted artillery, and the ability to concentrate their forces at the exact point of attack. For the Allies to have any chance of success at Normandy, they needed one crucial thing above everything else. They needed surprise. Not just surprise about when the invasion would happen, but surprise about where. Because if the Germans correctly identified Normandy as the target and moved their full armored strength to that coastline before the invasion began, the Allied soldiers landing on those beaches would face an almost impossible task. The Panzers would be waiting. The beaches would be death traps from which no army could escape. The Allies had to make Germany look the other way. Operation Fortitude was built on a single, brilliant idea. Make the Germans believe the real invasion was coming somewhere else entirely. The location the Allies chose to point at was the Pas de Calais, the stretch of French coastline directly across the English Channel from Dover, England. It was the closest point between Britain and France, the most logical place to launch an invasion, and for exactly that reason, it was the place the Germans were most heavily defending and most expecting to be attacked. The Allies leaned into that expectation and made it a weapon. They created a completely fictional military force, the first United States Army Group, that existed on paper, on the radio waves, and in fake military camps designed to be spotted by German reconnaissance aircraft, but nowhere else. This ghost army had fake radio traffic, simulating the movement of real units. It had dummy landing craft assembled in British harbors, visible from the air. It had soldiers marching in and out of fictional headquarters. And most importantly, it had a commander, a very real, very famous, very recognizable commander, General George S. Patton. Patton was the American general the Germans feared and respected most. He was aggressive, unpredictable, and had already proven himself in North Africa and Sicily. To the German High Command, it was completely logical that the Allies would give their most important command, the real invasion force, to their best general. And so, when German intelligence reported that Patton was commanding a massive army group in southeastern England, perfectly positioned to strike at Pas de Calais, they believed it. The deception was working. But creating a fake army was not enough on its own. The Allies needed to feed that false information directly into German intelligence, and they had the perfect tool to do it. Throughout the war, British intelligence had achieved something extraordinary. They had identified, captured, and turned virtually every German spy operating in Britain. Rather than imprisoning or executing these agents, the British fed them false information to pass back to their German handlers. These double agents became the backbone of Operation Fortitude. The most famous among them was a Spaniard known by the codename Garbo, a man who had actually invented a network of fictional sub-agents that he reported to his German handlers, none of whom existed. He was so trusted by German intelligence that he had been awarded an Iron Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors, for his valuable reports, and those reports were entirely written by the British. When Garbo and the other double agents began feeding information to Berlin, confirming the buildup of a massive Allied force in southeastern England, confirming Patton's command, confirming preparations that pointed unmistakably at Pas de Calais, German intelligence had no reason to doubt it. The picture was consistent, the sources were trusted, the logic was sound. Normandy, if it came up at all, was a sideshow, a distraction, perhaps even a deliberate feint designed to draw attention away from the real blow, which would come at Pas de Calais. Here is the most astonishing part of the story. Operation Fortitude did not just work before the invasion, it kept working after the invasion had already begun.
When Allied soldiers hit the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders at the highest levels remained genuinely uncertain whether this was the main attack or an elaborate ruse designed to pull them away from Pas de Calais. Hitler himself, even as reports flooded in about the scale of the Normandy landings, held back several panzer divisions near Pas de Calais for weeks after D-Day, convinced that the real invasion was still coming.
And Garbo made sure of it. On the night of June 6th, as the landings were already underway, Garbo sent an urgent message to his German handlers, warning them that the Normandy attack was a diversion, that the main Allied force under Patton was still waiting to strike at Pas de Calais, and that Germany must not be tricked into depleting their reserves. German High Command received the message, considered it, and agreed. The Panzer reserves stayed put. Normandy, meanwhile, was being transformed from a desperate gamble into a secured beachhead with every passing hour. But let us return to the German units that were finally ordered to move toward Normandy after Hitler gave his authorization that afternoon. The Panzer divisions began their march toward the coast, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles moving through the French countryside, down roads that had been calmly peaceful just hours before. They never made it in time. The Allied air forces had anticipated exactly this. Before a single tank reached the Normandy coastline, waves of fighter bombers were hunting them, attacking columns on the roads, destroying bridges, hitting fuel supplies, and turning the march into a running nightmare of explosions and mechanical chaos. Tanks that had survived thousands of miles of Russian steppe and North African desert were being destroyed on French country roads before they ever fired a shot at an Allied soldier. The combination of deception, delay, and air superiority had created a catastrophe the German armored forces simply could not recover from. By the end of June 6th, the Allies were on the beach, they were holding, and they were growing stronger by the hour. Germany's chance to throw them back into the sea was gone. But how did it come to this? The answer lies deeper than a sleeping leader and a brilliant deception. It lies in the very structure of how Germany organized, or rather failed to organize, its command. There is a question that military historians have debated for 80 years. Could Germany have won on D-Day? Could the German army, had everything gone differently, have driven the Allied forces back into the sea on June 6, 1944, and changed the course of the entire Second World War? The honest answer is probably not. The Allies had overwhelming numbers. They had complete air superiority. They had years of planning, extraordinary logistics, and the industrial might of the United States behind them. Even under the best possible circumstances, stopping the D-Day invasion entirely would have been extraordinarily difficult for Germany. But here is a question that is harder to dismiss. Could Germany have made it far more costly? Could they have inflicted casualties so devastating, resistance so fierce that the Allied advance would have slowed or even stalled, giving Germany precious time to regroup, to negotiate, to change the outcome in ways we can only imagine? The answer to that question is almost certainly yes, and why they failed to do so tells us something important, not just about the Second World War, but about leadership itself. To begin, consider Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. In the summer of 1944, Rundstedt was 68 years old. He was one of the most decorated and experienced officers in the German military, a man who had commanded forces in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, a soldier's soldier, respected by enemies and allies alike. And in theory, he was the supreme commander of German forces in Western Europe. In theory. In practice, Rundstedt's authority was riddled with holes. He did not control the German Navy operating off the coast of France. He did not control the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which was answerable to Hermann Göring, who answered only to Hitler. He did not control the Waffen-SS divisions, which reported through a separate chain directly to Heinrich Himmler. And, most critically, as we have already seen, he did not control the Panzer Reserve divisions.
This was not a minor administrative inconvenience. This was a command structure that made unified, rapid, decisive action almost impossible. Think about what that means in practice. On the morning of June 6th, when Rundstedt looked at his map and understood that Normandy was the real invasion, when he made the correct military judgment that the panzers needed to move immediately, he could not simply give the order. He had to request permission from Hitler, who was asleep. An experienced, capable commander was reduced to making phone calls and waiting, while the most consequential military operation of the 20th century unfolded on the beaches 60 miles away. To understand why this command structure existed, you have to understand something about the culture inside the German military by 1944. Hitler's relationship with his generals had been deteriorating for years. Early in the war, Germany's military successes were spectacular. The fall of France in 6 weeks, the rapid advance into the Soviet Union, the conquest of most of Western Europe. And Hitler had credited himself for much of it, believing his strategic instincts superior to the professional military establishment.
When things began going wrong on the Eastern Front, when the early victories turned into grinding, bloody attrition, Hitler's response was not to trust his generals more, it was to trust them less. He began overriding tactical decisions at every level. He appointed and dismissed commanders with terrifying frequency. He moved divisions around on maps like chess pieces, often ignoring the realities on the ground that his generals were desperately trying to communicate. The result was a culture of fear and dysfunction at the top of the German military. Generals learned not to bring Hitler bad news. They learned not to contradict him, not to push back, not to advocate too strongly for courses of action he had already dismissed. The ones who did found themselves relieved of command, humiliated, or worse. And so, on the morning of June 6, 1944, Hitler's staff let him sleep. Not out of incompetence, not out of indifference, out of fear. There is one more cruel twist to this story that history often overlooks. Where was Erwin Rommel on the morning of the D-Day invasion? He was in Germany. Rommel, a commander of Army Group B, the man most directly responsible for repelling the Allied invasion, the general who had argued most passionately that the battle would be decided in the first hours, had gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday. He had chosen that particular weekend because Allied meteorologists had forecast rough weather over the English Channel. Bad weather would make an amphibious landing extremely difficult. Rommel believed, reasonably, that there would be no invasion that weekend. He was wrong. The Allies launched anyway through a brief break in the storms that the Germans had not predicted, and on the morning that would define the entire Western Front, the one German commander who had planned and prepared most specifically for this moment was hundreds of miles away, unreachable for hours as the situation developed. He rushed back to his headquarters the moment the news reached him, but by then, the critical decisions had already been unmade. The critical hours had already been wasted. The critical window had already closed. Step back and look at the full picture. Germany's defense of Normandy failed because of 3 connected disasters, each one made possible by the same underlying problem. A sleeping Hitler who could not be woken because no one had clear authority to act without him. A brilliant Allied deception that kept commanders uncertain because there was no unified intelligence leadership to cut through the confusion. Panzer divisions destroyed on the road by Allied airpower because the delay caused by the first 2 failures gave the Allies time to establish air cover over the entire battle zone. 3 disasters, 1 root cause, a broken chain of command. No single person in the German military structure had the authority, the information, and the resources necessary to respond to the invasion quickly and decisively. Power was fragmented,
responsibility was diffused, and when the moment of crisis arrived, the moment that demanded instant, unified, overwhelming action, the system collapsed under its own contradictions. Historians will argue forever about the counterfactuals, what might have happened if Rommel had been there, if Hitler had been awake, if the Panzers had moved 6 hours earlier. But the real lesson of Normandy is not about tanks or timing or deception. It is about what happens when leadership fails at the structural level. In any organization, military, corporate, governmental, there is a temptation to concentrate power at the top, to make the leader the final authority on every decision, large or small. It feels safe, it feels controlled, it feels like nothing can happen without your approval. But that structure has a fatal weakness. The moment the leader is unavailable, sleeping, traveling, overwhelmed, ill, distracted, the entire organization freezes. Decisions that should take minutes take hours. Problems that should be solved by empowered, capable people on the ground instead wait in a queue, growing worse with every passing moment. June 6, 1944 changed the world. Within a year of that day on the beaches of Normandy, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, the Third Reich had collapsed, and the map of the world was being redrawn. History turned on many things that day: courage, sacrifice, luck, and the extraordinary planning and deception of the Allied forces. But it also turned on a decision made years before the first ship crossed the Channel. The decision to put everything, every tank, every order, every critical moment in the hands of one man, and to never allow anyone to question him, and to let that man sleep while history moved on without him. Hitler's Germany did not fail at Normandy because it lacked courageous soldiers, capable commanders, or powerful weapons. It failed because the man at the top had made himself so indispensable, so completely the single point of authority, that when he was unavailable for half a day, an entire army stood still. The beaches of Normandy are quiet now. Green fields stretch over what was once the most contested ground on Earth. But the lesson written into that soil 80 years ago is as relevant today as it was on that June morning. Without a clear chain of command, even the most powerful forces in the world can be stopped, not by the enemy, but by themselves.